Greetings, everybody. Hi, thanks for coming. I'm John Barton from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and I'd like to welcome you to our 2021 ALA panel titled Hopkins and Social Justice, sponsored by the Pauline Hopkins Society. I wanted to thank our panelists and everyone in attendance for being here today. Also, I'd like to remind everybody that the Zoom session is being recorded and will appear on a new ALA YouTube channel during the in-person convention next month in July. As panel chair, I'll briefly review the structure of this panel, introduce our panelists, and help keep track of time. We have 90 minutes for the whole session here. Our speakers will present in the order in which they appear on the ALA program, followed by remarks from our respondent. And whatever time we have remaining will be for questions. So it'd be best if everybody can keep their microphones off unless they're presenting or asking a question during the Q&A session. And I'll ask the panelists to give the titles of their talks when they begin presenting. Okay, so our first presenter is Hubert Cook. Dr. Cook is the Sue and Eugene Mercy Assistant Professor of English at Connecticut College. His research focuses on affect, emotion, performativity in late 19th and early 20th century African-American and Caribbean literature. Dr. Cook is completing his first book entitled Empathy's Dark Labor. Our second speaker is Kelsey Flint-Martin, who recently received her PhD from the University of South Carolina. She's presented at various conferences, including the MLA and MELIS. Dr. Flint-Martin's dissertation titled Spatial Orphans, Cultural Mobility and the Extranatural in Black American Literature describes characters in African-American and Afro-Caribbean literature who feel disconnected from home, region, or nation, thanks to operations of structural racism and diasporic deracination. Our third presenter is April Logan. She's an assistant professor of English at Salisbury University, specializing in African-American literature, women's studies, and performance studies. In addition, Dr. Logan is a Mellon Scholars postdoctoral fellow at the Library Company of Philadelphia and vice president, former president of the Pauline Hopkins Society. Her publications include poetry and chapters on African-American women writers. Finally, our respondent, John Gruser, is senior research scholar at Sam Houston State University and the Pauline Hopkins Society historian. Dr. Gruser is the editor of The Unruly Voice, Rediscovering Pauline Hopkins, and co-editor with Alicia Knight of the Broadview edition of Hopkins, Hagar's Daughter, published in 2021. His forthcoming books include the essay collection, Animals in the Classics, How Natural History Inspired Great American Fiction, and that's going to be with Texas A&M University Press, and A Literary Life of Sutton E. Griggs, The Man on the Firing Line, and that is with Oxford University Press, coming out in 2022. Thanks for being here, and let's begin with Dr. Cook.
Thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks to John Barton, who managed a number of changes to bring us together in this time of global pandemic. Thanks also to John Gruser for taking the time to comment on our papers, and to the Pauline Hopkins Society for hosting us. After Seeming Death, Justice and the Making of Equivocal Bodies and Pauline Hopkins's Of One Blood. As Dr. Rule Briggs of Pauline Hopkins's serialized novel, Of One Blood, examines Dianthe Lust's stiffened body in order to evaluate her candidacy for the medical procedure of which he is expert, reanimation after seeming death, Briggs muses that the body is in death what it ostensibly was in life, a prison for ideas about persons. Other medical professionals standing in wait have already diagnosed Lust's body as experiencing the inevitable decay of rigor mortis, the literal loss of the body's plasticity that serves as sure sign that death is in place. And these professionals expect Briggs to confirm the verdict. Briggs, however, determines that Lusk exists in suspended animation. His claim already gestures toward an experimentation in which meanings about the body aren't hardened or fully consolidated. Marvel's Briggs. The most marvelous thing to watch is the death of a person. At the moment the opposite takes place to that which took place when life entered the first unit, after nature had prepared it for the inception of life. How the vigorous life watches the passage of the liberated life out of its earthly environment. What a change is this! How important the knowledge of whither life tends. Here is shown the setting free of a disciplined spirit, giving up its mortality for immortality, the condition necessary to know God. Death. There is no death. Life is everlasting, and from its reality can have no end. Life is real and never changes. Briggs works in three categories: persons, bodies, and lives. Briggs distinguishes persons from bodies. In Briggs's musing, bodies are material units that nature prepares. Persons are stories about those material units that nature has prepared. Briggs differentiates still more. He separates lives from persons and bodies. It is as if life is the vigorous consciousness able to observe the interplay between persons and bodies. It is as if life is separate from the stories that the first unit inspires, is separate from the person. In Briggs's view, the interplay of meaning between person and body, between projection and scrim, between stories of the unit and its earthly environment, imprisons lives. To watch the death of a person, then, is to witness the dissolution of stories regarding the body. And it is to unfetter a life besieged by its person. Briggs's musing offers up an instructive schematic with which to think about lives. He suggests that civil death, the legal ritual that imprisons persons, stripping them of rights, exposes the potential and the need for equivocal bodies, which, following literary scholar Vera Kaczynski, I define as the process through which a repressed cultural memory is exposed to the human form of itself. If all of these meanings that directly inflect what makes lives livable proceed from interpretations of the body, that is, from readings of that first unit, it would seem that toggling the body and how we understand it would destabilize the person, those stories about the body, creating room for lives. In other words, an inability to mark the body would also mean an inability to mark a life, bringing about its protection while foreclosing its full enclosure. As Kaczynski has argued, bodies, individual and collective, stabilize not only political ideologies, but also literal representations and ways of reading them. In such stability, whither life tends. Drawing relationship between borders and bodies, Kaczynski examines what possibilities emerge when the body becomes equivocal. She ventures, I want to know what exactly happens to the assumed integrity of the identities of humans and nations alike when the bodies that are supposed to stabilize or ground each identity surreptitiously turn into someone or something else. This paper thinks with Kaczynski and with literary and legal scholars Colin Diane and Luca Tallis in order to propose a relation between civil death and the making of equivocal bodies in Pauline Hopkins's Of One Blood that would challenge the constitution and presentation of sovereign power as unitary, undivided, and absolute. By considering justice's role in the formation of an equivocal body in the serialized novel Of One Blood, author Pauline Hopkins obscures whether her Black woman protagonist is alive or dead. In the course of the novel, not only will Diane Lusk, a Black woman with a skin tone light enough to pass as white, appear as a ghost to other characters, but she will also be the recipient of an experimental procedure by a Black doctor, reanimation after seeming death, that will awaken her from a mesmeric trance, but dispossess her of all of her memories and the knowledge that she is a Black woman. I argue that when Hopkins collapses a lust that lived in the past, a repressed cultural memory, with a lust that lives in the present, a human form, she exposes lust's body to the cultural memory of itself, producing what Verikasensky calls an equivocal body. By making Lusk an equivocal body, and as such radically unlocatable in the novel's narrative, Hopkins protects Lusk from readers who would presume to know Black womanhood. Hopkins's rendition of Lusk, then, resists a gendered Blackness that is transparently knowable in the eyes of the reader. She forces the reader to reorder what they know about Black women's liveliness and about death in a world of terror. With this reading, I aim to think through how Hopkins's work brings to the foreground the workings of the political. As Black studies and Black literary studies reckons with what Blackness is and how it has persisted or transformed over time, in the relation between civil death and equivocation, Hopkins offers scholars a historically contextualized account of the body, not decontextualized from the public, but within it, and all of its attending relations and cultural meanings. Through Diane Lusk, scholars can consider the ways post-emancipation Blackness existed in the realm of the political and marked public political standing. In this regard, Hopkins tends to the body not as an object of utility, but as a signifier for attending to relations in an American democracy. What I am after is a way to think through equivocation not only as a means, as a technology of protection, but also as providing coordinates, however diffuse, for the life that such equivocation might risk obscuring. Lusk will turn up on Halloween as a ghostly gossamer apparition in a character's vision, and she will encounter an old Black woman with a sphinx's face who, upon seeing her, croons in a mournful minor cadence a funeral chant sung by Negroes over the dead. The challenge Lusk poses is that equivocation might be the condition for one's legibility and at the same time the condition for one's erasure. Equivocation offers at once a knowing and an unknowing. Both Colin Diane and Luca Tallis advance ways to think through the bodily equivocation in their respective treatises on how the law can unmake persons that are instructive regarding Lusk's purported status and Briggs's rumination about the death of a person. Diane deconstructs the ritual of civil death, one that she argues emerged with the abolishment of US slavery and resurfaced as a literal and legal via negativa, in order to lend attention to how one, here specifically the prisoner, might be granted a natural life while encased in an unnatural death. To be civilly dead was to have one's identity systematically dismantled. It described a passage from possession to deprivation, from plenitude to emptiness. Legal scholar Luca Tallis documents that civil death existed in New York State's common law as early as 1799, where convicts were treated by law as if factually dead. According to Tallis, civil death's origins run parallel to the disappearance of public punishments and the eventual substitution of imprisonment as the primary penalty for criminal offenses. It was a surrogate for capital punishment, a symbolic parallel to the death a convict would have suffered before New York legislature's reduction of capital crimes in 1796. It is important to note that I do make distinction between civic death and social death, which historian Vincent Brown uses sociologist Orlando Patterson's work and understands as the absence of a meaningful link to the past. Civil death places subjects in the legal and political realm and within the precincts of American law. As literary historian Janine de Lombard has asserted, civil death produced incapacitated legal insiders. It placed subjects in a political realm and rendered them able to elaborate citizenship in an American democracy. Imprisonment, Diane contends, was used to make these living beings, the dead who do not in fact die but live in death. What is more pressing, more spectacular than the realm of the flesh and bones ghost, the palpable specter watching over its own perpetual degradation, Diane posits. Embedded in Diane's query is the discernment of the same spectacular scene Briggs fathoms when he marvels about the fettered life, how the vigorous life watches the passage of the liberated life out of its earthly environment. Diane's mashup of seemingly contradictory descriptors, having flesh and bones modify ghosts, emphasizes the socially constructed depersonalization that lives endure. Diane exposes the logic that allows, nay, needs Lusk to at once have a material body and to exist as a specter. The body is needed for the play of signification that would convert it to a person, and the body is abandoned when stories about that body would exculpate it from injury. In other words, Lusk's spectral status denotes how one's body is used as a matter of convenient personhood in law. As Diane documents, numerous 19th century cases demonstrated the staying power of civil death, crucial not only to legal status, but to personal identity and to the sacrifice of that identity to punishment. Instead of explicitly abolishing the status of the person, civil death rendered the prisoner unable to exercise the rights attached to a person. Diane documents how stories about the body equated in what was possible for and in everyday lives. Even still, Diane's description of ghosts also draws attention to the idea that the play of signification on bodies and persons might have refracted differently. Even depersonalization proposes an investment. Writes Diane, ghosts are never proof of vacancy, but evidence of plenitude. They return chock full of memories and longing. For them, nothing is ever past, and sometimes they appear to test the limits of death or its meaning in a world of terror. With ghosts, then, the neither living nor dead, the neither here nor there, Diane suggests that even suspicious ontologies have positive charge. Such ghost stories are nothing more than body stories. They are then about personhood, and they thus are also about the political. If you do away with the person, given that personhood is the instrument by which you get rights, then what happens to you? Death as a fact and as a conceit pervades of one blood. And the novel offers up in Lusk a character whose equivocation already serves as a critique of the civic life available to late 19th century Black women, and also of a possibility for otherwise. Diane herself concludes that ritual civil death emphasizes that legal action attends to what is bodily, but ignores the diminishing of personal dignity, the loss of mental capacity. Like the sorcery that chained the spirit to dog flesh, juridical reason defines a new legal body that buries the mind, recognizing only the corporeal husk of thought. Civil death, which creates the flesh and bone ghost for whom lust offers surrogate, prioritizes the body. Nonetheless, what Briggs marvels about is the process through which the material form becomes collapsed with other people's ideas about that material form. For of one Blood's Briggs, death offers liberation from a life that was ostensibly imprisoned. Briggs figures the body as a corporeal husk, to use Diane's phrasing, for the thoughts of others. Even in death, the meanings that had attended the body do not dissolve. Briggs, too, upon seeing Lusk and seeming death, has the play of signification proceed as he invests Lusk with his own desires. He stood for some seconds gazing down on Diane. Every nerve quivered, every pulse of his body throbbed. Her face held for him a wonderful charm, an extraordinary fascination. As he gazed, he knew that once more he beheld what he had vaguely sought and yearned for all of his life. Briggs himself demonstrates how personhood is created. He makes Lusk a figure of desire, scientific and otherwise. He is yet another voice that challenges a unitary description of life. Thus, to return to legal scholar Luca Tallis, Hopkins's treatment of Lusk makes a historical qualification for civil death that evinces how power, legal and otherwise, was not unitary as it often presented itself, but that it was rather fragmented, decentralized, and discontinuous. Through Lusk, Hopkins suggests that the route to achieve unfettered life is to make the same body needed to retain rights that inhere with personhood available for equivocation, to expose the human form to the cultural memory of itself. Hopkins suggests that you need personhood to exercise rights, but also that death offers up a schematic for human arrangements that could be used to liberate the body's use as a husk for others' thoughts. To have the body equivocate, then, is to offer it protection from crude uses.
John, I'm going to assume you were muted, so I will move on. So my paper is titled Caste Prejudice, Race Pride, Boundless Wealth, Scintillating Intellects, Pauline Hopkins' Response to Booker T. Washington in the Colored American Magazine and Of One Blood or the Hidden Self. In Greg Lasky's Untimely Democracy, he describes a common trend throughout Pauline Hopkins' body of work. Hopkins, quote, attempts to reconstruct America into a democratic nation by shifting its privileged temporal interval from the present and future to the present past. Her attempts to do this came amidst political, racial, gender, and financial barriers, including those she experienced while publishing in and working at the Colored American Magazine from 1900 to 1904. And to make things a little less wordy, I will just call it the CAM from here on out. Extensive scholarship has covered Hopkins' ideological disputes with Washington that eventually led to her being forced out of the magazine. And Alicia Knight actually writes, quote, Hopkins used her magazine writing to advocate a particular success formula for African Americans that differed from the traditional Western or white formula, and at the same time to protest against Booker T. Washington's brand of racial uplift. I believe we can see this dispute appear in Hopkins' writing style in her serialized novel, Of One Blood or the Hidden Self, particularly through her use of temporality. While the novel covers a web of entangled relationships and spans continents, the primary plotline follows the journey of a Black passing for white doctor named Real Briggs as he travels from Boston to Africa for work and discovers he's the king of a hidden Ethiopian society. I suggest there's a shift in representations of temporality from a form of progressive temporal marker to the present past, to use Lasky's term. More specifically, I want to argue that the stylistic shifts in temporality in Hopkins of One Blood correspond with the change of ownership in the CAM in 1903 to highlight not only the freedoms that came with new ownership and her new role as literary editor, but also how she used her influence within the CAM to balance audience and owner expectations, ones that, if not sympathetic to Washington, at least tolerated his beliefs, with her own ideologies. And I want to note here that I'm not suggesting that Pauline Hopkins could see the future and that she knew the ownership would happen and she could publish whatever she wanted, more so that her increased editorial powers after the shift would allow her greater control over what she published and give her the opportunity to edit her work if it was already written. So in order to make this, I'm going to first review a brief history of the magazine, its politics, and her role within the CAM, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. And I will then turn to Of One Blood to provide some examples of temporal representations from before and after the 1903 change. And while I do primarily focus on race in this paper, mostly for the sake of time, I'm also incredibly interested in how the shifts in temporality also reveals Hopkins' engagement with gender. So if I have a little time, I'll touch on that. Otherwise, I would love to talk about that further in questions. So from at least the second issue of the CAM in June 1900, Pauline Hopkins was editor of the women's column. The publication was owned by the Colored Cooperative Publishing Company, and Alicia Knight explains that many of the board members were, quote, transplanted Southerners who, quote, may have felt some affinity with one of the few Southern Blacks to achieve national prominence, meaning Booker T. Washington. In other words, while the CAM may have promoted different ideals than Washington, such as the magazine's, quote, devotion to the higher culture of religion, literature, science, music, and art of the Negro, they were also not keen on critiquing him directly. The owners also had to consider the purpose and audience of the magazine. According to Sigrid Anderson Cordell, the journal had to, 1, follow the ideals they set forth in their mission statement, 2, prove that a Black magazine of the sort was going to be read and appreciated by Black audiences, while 3, proving to white audiences that the magazine was actually making a difference. Cordell adds to the reasoning to avoid challenging Washington, writing, quote, in order for Washington to make an investment financially in the magazine, it could not too directly flout his political agenda. And this led ownership to put pressure on writers like Hopkins to avoid challenging Washington's conciliatory policies too openly. Well, in 1903, due to financial troubles, the magazine was purchased by William Dupree, among others. And it was also at this time that Hopkins took over as literary editor. Although this is a bit debated, Hazel Carby suggests that maybe her literary power or her editorial powers occurred far sooner, while some say they didn't happen until November of 1903. But for the purposes of this, we're going with Hopkins taking over in May of 1903. Lewis Brown describes a positive relationship between the new owner and Hopkins. In particular, Hopkins, quote, benefited from Dupree's efforts to preserve the literary and editorial integrity of the magazine, as he emphasized preserving the right to free speech for the Colored American magazine. In other words, Dupree supported Hopkins' decision to use her influential role within the Colored American magazine. And while Hopkins did write in a letter to William Monroe Trotter that, quote, the new management maintained a respectful and conservative attitude toward Mr. Washington's policies, but held firm to race fealty, Dupree allowed her to publish editorial pieces that were, quote, anti-Bookerite. And Knight provides an example of this, explaining that within the same issue, publishing the reprint of Washington's The Storm Before the Calm, there's also an anonymous editorial that appears in a voice very similar to Hopkins that disputes these claims. So with this history in mind, I want to give a quick overview of the settings of One Blood, particularly so we can identify where exactly the shift in ownership and Hopkins' roles occurred. The easiest way to do this with how confusing the plot of Of One Blood can be is just through location. Boston, its surrounding countryside, and Ethiopia serve as the main settings for Of One Blood under the colored co-op. While set in Boston, both the structure and content emphasize a progressive temporality in which calendars, holidays, and moving forward are primary attributes of time. Even as Cyril travels to Africa to earn money to support his new wife, time is still marked by clear temporal markers that the reader would be able to acknowledge as progressive. As such, I suggest these progressive temporalities represent the restraints of ownership on Hopkins' writing, namely that she needed to address Washington's idea of assimilation for the Black community, embracing a partially realist tone and reflecting, again, partially the conciliatory aspects of the CAM. After Dupree takes over ownership of the magazine and Hopkins becomes literary editor, the space lent to serialization of the story shrinks. It reduces from about 9 pages all the way down to 4, but articles start showing up such as why we seek higher education or education a means rather than an end, and the race problem. The setting and representations of time in the story also change. Riol has been taken to a hidden city called Telassar, and the people in the city reveal he's the descendant of an ancient royal line of Ethiopians who were the original creators of many arts and sciences. Telassar stresses the importance of preservation. While the people are more advanced than Americans in many things, they're also insistent upon the preservation of the past because moving forward in time does not guarantee improvement. As the novel ends by suggesting that nothing but God can stop the insistence of progress from destroying Black creations of beauty and intelligence, I suggest that Hopkins used the ending of her novel to encourage Black audiences to maintain their own advancement through intellectual pursuits while using a biblical reference to maintain her role as impartial literary editor who could appeal to white and Black audiences alike. So I'm going to start with the before the ownership shift. Of One Blood actually begins with the following lines. The recitations were over for the day. It was the first week in November, and it had rained about every day the entire week. While Hopkins is on the surface, just establishing a setting likely familiar to her Boston readers, a rainy November week at the start or in Boston, this opening serves as a powerful reminder of the banal nature of progressive temporality. In these 2 sentences alone, there's a progression from start to end of the day, start to end of the week, a switch between autumn and winter, and the implied progression from start to end of the year. We're already in November. Rather than suggest any change, however, Hopkins' use of the structured progressive temporality shows how little changes. This pairs with the activity that begins her story, recitations. In a school setting, the term recitation often refers to the smaller courses that break out from the larger groups, the ones that TAs often teach. This, in combination with the exacting schedule, seems to align with Washington's own stress on scheduling for the Tuskegee Institute, where, quote, every activity was tied to the clock in order to impose an orderly personality. Yet recitation also refers to the act of repeating something, generally from memory, and during which nothing is changed, a continuous repetition without developing knowledge. So while a surface reading of these first 2 lines suggests little more than an average day at school for someone and a almost Bookerite appeal to structure, Hopkins' double meanings show how inefficient this emphasis on progression is for Black people if the goal is to create change rather to maintain their status in American society. The representation of progressive temporality continues through the choice of every chapter title while the action is still set in Boston. This includes specific holidays, including Halloween, Hallow Eve, and Christmas. Both holidays are used not only to show a passage of time, but to set a progressive scene for the occurrences in each chapter. And for time purposes, I can't go too into depth of this, and Hubert covered it a lot, but the Halloween scene where the ghost shows up is kind of a reduction in time from hour to minute. But then when Dianthe appears in ghost form, she says, you can help me, but not now, tomorrow. The time is not yet. And I think that's another gender point that I'm really interested in exploring. So while I cannot really fit every instance of progressive temporality into this paper, nor it would probably bore you if I tried, Hopkins does rely extensively on these markers, even as Cyril travels to Ethiopia to work as a doctor. And time does become less marked by minute, but by longer increments of time. For example, while on the ship between Boston and Ethiopia, time for Riel is repetitive. But Hopkins makes sure to note that he is still performing his work in a structured and progressive way. Riel, quote, kept busy for many days, and he thinks about Dianthe, quote, 1,000 times a day while he performs his duties mechanically. Much like the concept of recitation, Riel repeats the same actions continually without learning or growth, highlighting the problematics of this method of progress. It is through Charlie, the white friend of Riel's, that Hopkins shares her more blatant critique of progressive temporality through a reflection that seems, on the surface, both positive and in support of Washington's ideologies. Quote, it was a desolation that doubled desolateness because his healthy American organization missed the march of progress, attested by the sound of hammers on unfinished buildings that told of a busy future in cozy modern homeliness. Here, there was no future. No railroads, no churches, no saloons, no schoolhouses to echo the voices of merry children or promise of the life that produces within the range of his vision. Nothing but the monotony of past centuries dead and forgotten. It seems that this type of progress, the progress of America, of hard work and hammers and homeliness, all of these which we might associate with Washington's emphasis on more manual labor, align with the ideals of white progress, ones that have thus far prohibited Black ascent in the US. Well, Charlie is not necessarily a villain in this story, so we may be able to see his critique of Ethiopia as Hopkins' ability to assimilate to Washington's own policies and appease her white audiences as well. But it is not long after Charlie makes this complaint without progress that Riel is knocked out on a nighttime wandering. And with that, the CAM goes on sabbatical and changes ownership hands. So after the break, when the serialized novel returns to print, there are far fewer instances of dates and times, what we might consider linear progress. As a result, the reader actually loses track of the amount of time their rule is in the hidden city, often relying on the description of sunrise and sunset to comprehend any passage of time. A sentence like, quote, a deep yellow glow soon gave way to powerful but mellow light of the African moon, shows no markable progress, according to time you could track on a calendar. The reader must instead focus on the wonders of Telsar rather than the progressive march of Riel's life, highlighting that which can occur when intellect is praised over insistent, although markable, progression. Moreover, this timeless or eternal feeling allows Hopkins' characters to have access to their past in order to better consider their present. I, the Prime Minister of Telsar, informs Riel of the purpose of closing off Telsar from the rest of the world, emphasizing both the concepts of preservation and cultural revitalization. I reveals that, quote, the direct descendants of the inhabitants of Meroe, secret from the intrusion of a world that is forgotten, for the coming of our king who shall restore the Ethiopian race to its ancient glory. The reason that Telsar has been able to stay hidden for so long, according to I, is that they played off of the outside world's obsession with progress. In their haste for continual advancement, the rest of the world simply forgot that Telsar existed, allowing the remaining people there to keep their secrets of the arts and sciences obscured from those obsessed with progress. As I gives Riel a tour of Telsar, I emphasizes the Ethiopians' belief in progress and reincarnation, both of which are part of a kind of circular temporality. First, I claims that, quote, here in Telsar are preserved specimens of the highest attainments the world knew in ancient days, implying that by stopping the advances of time within Telsar, the people are also safe from losing any of their superior knowledge. I also shows off the ability to, quote, preserve the bodies of our most beautiful women. And I'm really interested actually to see what Hubert thinks of the preserved women in Telsar, because I think that our papers overlap a little bit there. Hopkins' representation of temporality within Telsar implies a sense of pride regarding this circular temporality, and thereby praises the present past as not only a method of maybe Black time, but as the best way to create actual change for Black people. And Hopkins does, I suggest, show us what happens when there is a white invasion into this present past time. In a jarring shift, Charlie discovers the entrance to Telsar, and the narration suddenly uses progressive time markers again. For half an hour, he and his servant hurried along. they waited an hour or two looking for an escape. Even Real's actions are no longer described by sunrise and sunset, but described by time on a clock. Marking temporal progress, as it turns out, according to Hopkins, is a white affair intended to limit the intellectual abilities of Black people. Overall, after the switch in ownership, it is not only the location that changes of one blood. Rather, Hopkins moves her serialized story from something that could, on the surface, appear to appease members of the colored co-op to a temporality that both seems to reject Washington's ideologies, but calls direct attention to the benefits of intellect and overcoming the whiteness of structured manual progress. The novel ends with Hopkins reminding readers, albeit gently, that the dangers of progress do not always come from people who are different in race, class, gender, or education. Real being fearful of, quote, the advance of mighty nations, the progressive advancement that Charlie desires. But he also brings in knowledge from America Telesar that advances Telesar society from within. Through her representations of temporality and of one blood, we can see how Hopkins' developing freedom as an editor led her to a more obvious, although still disguised, critique of Washington's ideologies. But we're also reminded in this case, as her role of editor, who must attract both Black and white readership while still balancing the policies of her editor. Considering the horrors that occur in novel for readers of the time, those of incest and encouraged suicide, it is perhaps unsurprising that she ends her novel with a potentially unifying appeal to religion, one that doesn't mark a circularity of temporality or a sense of progress. Rather, Hopkins notes that regardless of intellect, money, caste, race, pride, the only one who can decide the fate of people is God, in and of himself, the great craftsman. In a direct reference to Acts 17:26, Hopkins ultimately suggests that she was only providing a message that would help promote God's word. After all, as much as she wanted to promote her own ideologies, attempting to keep the colored American magazine in circulation to celebrate Black people, Black writers, and Black stories showed that she could also practice what she published.
Thank you. I'm going to share a screen to let me see where it is. So, are you all, can someone let me know if you're able to see this? I'm having some technical difficulties, of course.
Yeah, I can see your your desktop.
Okay, hold on, let me see what happened. Hold on, I don't know what happened.
You did have your PowerPoint up before we started. It was appearing fine.
Yeah.
I'll say Hubert and Kelsey, thank you so much for the presentations. I should have thought out how to do the clapping, how to respond properly. So we had these silent hands and Hubert had the icon. So we'll save the applause till the very end. I'll turn my mic off now, April. If you need help, just give a shout out. But we did see it we saw it earlier.
Okay, just a second. Now it might be working. Can you see it now?
April, we're seeing your syllabus.
Okay, let me just stop share for a minute. Let me try it one more time. Can you see the slideshow now? You can, okay. So the title of this talk is Sappho's Laughter, Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins Satire. In 1899, the Women's Journal Gossip and Gleanings column reported that a Miss Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins, a colored woman of Boston, is about to publish an anti-lynching novel called Contending Forces. Anticipating such a scandal, Hopkins asserts in the work's preface that she has, quote, introduced enough of the exquisitely droll humor peculiar to the Negro to give a bright touch to an otherwise gruesome topic. Indeed, one finds in it the sexual double entendres of protagonist Sappho Clark, Sappho's close friend Doris Smith, and the dialogue several chapters. Hence, although contemporary readers might struggle with whether to laugh with Sappho about sexism, Hopkins unapologetically rebels against the violence and inhumanity of her times through comedy. In this paper, I argue that Hopkins registers her dissent from injustice through humor across her creative oeuvre and as an editor for the Colored American magazine. Several established scholars in the fields of English and history, such as Augusta Roebuck, Jill Bergman, and Betty Collier Thomas, have noted Hopkins' use of parody in her fiction. And Lois Brown has also recognized her satire, but only in Peculiar Sam or the Underground Railroad. The line connecting the dots of this important scholarship is my own ongoing research into Hopkins' editorial practices and aesthetics. Drawing on diverse archival materials in the John Hope and Aurelia E. Franklin Library Special Collections and Archives of Fisk University, newspaper articles, theatrical programs and playbills, and Hopkins' scrapbook, unpublished plays and letters, I reveal that Hopkins studied satire during the 19th century to later question, as well as controversially mock, perceptions of race, gender, and sexuality that were popular among Blacks and whites. In this paper, I will provide a brief overview of the relationship between Hopkins' only known extant scrapbook and satire, analyze her scrapbook as a record of her interest in satire, and then briefly provide evidence of her satirization in her fiction and editorship of the Colored American magazine. Although many scholars and laymen view satire as a literary form whose focus is almost exclusively deriding individuals and institutions, Jonathan Greenberg foregrounds satire's deep investments in adding to and influencing, but not necessarily settling, popular discourses about provocative and even disturbing topics, issues, and ideas in his The Cambridge Introduction to Satire. Greenberg anchors his expansive overview of, quote, kinds of satires and the unifying qualities of three popular satires across cultures from the 17th century to today. A John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester poem, a 2012 review by New York Times restaurant critic Pete Wells, and Solomon Rushdie's Satanic Verses. He asserts that they, quote, enact some judgment or attack, quote, seem to refer to real world historical people, even when those people are disguised or transmuted into fictional identities, and, quote, provoke real world controversy. They intervene in the world's business. In his explication, Greenberg includes an important qualification, quote, yet none of these writings is merely a work of aggression or transgression. They all shape their judgments into an artistic form and blend attack with entertainment, he elaborates. In other words, one of the characteristics of satire that is always that it is always on some level pleasurable. And such pleasure derives from not only the artistry of the text, but the familiarity and socio-political importance of its topics and ideas, no matter how troubling they might be. Participating in and witnessing the creation of new meanings from a variety of popular national and local texts were pleasures that 19th century scrapbookers, editors, and satirists shared. Indeed, parody, When an author imitates another work to find humor in its style and or ideas is one of the genres most commonly associated with satire. However, Greenberg draws our attention to mock forms, which occur when satire, quote, appropriates another genre in a way that uses the prior form less as a target of attack or even respectful imitation than as a handy framework for, end quote, the social or institutional follies or vices it critiques. I would add that mock forms are easier to overlook because they can mirror the entirety of a work or merely a piece or section of it. He explains, quote, but the mock epic is not only a discrete subgenre, it can also be a satiric technique. It can function locally as well as globally. End quote. Scrapbooking is much like the technique of mock forms, and that an individual takes only one article, image, advertisement, or adage from an entire newspaper and revises its meanings by placing it into the new context of her scrapbook in terms of its placement in the scrapbook and relationship to other clippings. Indeed, in Writing with Scissors, American Scrapbooks from the Civil War to the Harlem Renaissance, Ellen Gruber Garvey notes that, quote, tens of thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of Americans, end quote, as well as journalists, clipped and pasted newspaper articles, often without attributing the sources, to preserve, disseminate, and reinterpret the wealth of knowledge that was generated by a growing print industry. Although editors contributed to the dizzying array of information they distributed, they also exerted control over what ideas dominated it by reproducing particular voices, facts, and details by reprinting articles over and over again. Quote, the newspaper clippings that eventually filled scrapbooks were on their journeys through the press, filling and refilling columns, reprinting and free recirculation were facts of life in 19th century US publishing, reveals Garvey. Then writers, artists, and readers sought to further synthesize such material to understand their world. Garvey notes, quote, in a sense, newspaper clippings, scrapbooks were simply filing systems, but because the clippings were fixed in place, they have left us a record of how people read and grappled with what they read. Therefore, Hopkins's Fisk University scrapbook provides a rare material window into how she set about interpreting and representing society to her audiences as a novelist, playwright, and editor. Although Garvey avers that newspaper clipping scrapbooks like Hopkins, quote, were often adjuncts to professional careers, Hopkins' newspaper clipping scrapbook documents her investigation of strategies that later enabled her to enter and intervene in national dialogues about race and sexuality through the 19th century's proliferation of technologies for circulating information. Revealingly, the text Hopkins chose to use for her clippings is essentially a published scrapbook. John Holmes' Agnew's The Gem of the Season with 20 Plates by Sartain that was published in 1846 contains Hopkins' clippings. Just to clarify, so again, she's using the book, The Gem, as her scrapbook. She's putting all of her newspaper clippings into this book. Given that it was created 13 years before she was born, her choice of this work might seem arbitrary. Yet her selection of The Gem does not reflect common scrapbooking practices, choices of her times. Garvey asserts that most Americans chose books more for their symbolic and material qualities than actual content, noting that, quote, they range from outdated school textbooks and government reports to used business farm and plantation ledgers and to novels, sermon collection, and Bibles, end quote. The Gem does not fit into any of these categories, but it is a unique phenomenon of the early 19th century. Literary anthologies given as gifts. Known as annuals, these anthologies allowed anyone with or able to acquire publishing connections to become a cultural critic and turn a profit while doing so. In his 1890 biography of Nathaniel Parker Willis, one of America's earliest authors to gain wealth and fame through his writing, Henry A. Beers explains the history of these gift books. Quote, "It was the age of annuals, gift books, boudoir books, books of beauty, flowers of loveliness, and leaflets of memory. The taste for these ornate combinations of literature and art was imported from England, where the Ackermans had published the Forget-Me-Not, the earliest specimen of the kind in 1823. Carey and Lee of Philadelphia brought out the first American annual in 1829, he details. Publishers marketed them to a general audience, and they were apparently quite profitable for well into the late 19th century. Beers adds some 40 of them, bearing such fantastic titles as the gem, the opal, the wreath, the casket, the rose, the amulet, the keepsake, pearls of the West, friendship's offering, and these are probably not half the list. There were religious annuals, juvenile annuals, oriental landscape, botanic annuals. Unlike contemporary anthologies, such gift books were able to win promotion by major publishers and a wide audience, whether or not they secured an author's permission to include his or her works, or were conceived by individuals with a literary background. John Holmes Agnew was the author of Hopkins's scrapbook, The Gem. Agnew was an obscure professor of ancient languages who also held a BA and a doctorate in theology and taught at several universities across the country before being lured into the New York book world. In fact, The Gem pages Hopkins leaves uncovered in tandem with the clippings she chooses create a manual for masterful acts of recycling, repurposing, and revising that reinvent diverse everyday texts, from classical music scores to stereotypes of womanhood and Blackness. Similarly, Garvey observes that, quote, scrapbooks reveal at least as much through what they chose to obliterate as in what they paste down. For example, Hopkins dedicates an entire page to articles that were circulated across time, periodicals, and state lines. Romantic poems and a parody of 19th century occultism and exploration are the only pages left intact. Before its inclusion in The Gem, the short story, Discovery of the Island of Mesmeria, first appeared in London's The New Monthly Magazine and Humorist in 1845. Given his religious education, Agnew likely was amused by the suggestion of individuals being controlled by another force rather than their own conscience or God. However, the British piece also suggests that the American narrative of discovering the New World is equally suspicious and laughable. In the work, one can also see the germ of the plot for Hopkins's serialized novel of One Blood, which similarly raises questions about the destructive influences on the collective consciousness of African Americans. In addition, Hopkins preserves an advertisement for a Boston performance of Gilbert and Sullivan's HMS Pinafore, which satirizes the British class hierarchy through the highly relevant but unsavory topic of baby farming. The Boston show that premiered in 1878 was only one among many of the unapologetic reproductions of the Gilbert and Sullivan play. Notably, it appeared just a year before Hopkins wrote and produced her critically acclaimed satirical musical play, Peculiar Sam. Indeed, across the scrapbook, historical romance, comedy, and theatrical, oratorical, and classical performances are the dominating themes. In my remaining time, I would like to briefly discuss the evidence of satire and contending forces in Hagar's Daughter. From our contemporary perspective, the tea scene between Sappho, Clark, and Doris Smith might have been quite tame. However, African-American women continue to be hypersexualized by the dominant culture and victimized by rape at the hands of white men. Moreover, they were under tremendous pressure from the dominant culture and African-American leaders to symbolize any traditional ideologies of respectability. Contending forces in Hagar's Daughter contrast Euro-American and African-American women's gender and sexuality as obstacles and avenues to social mobility and thus political agency through subtext provided by popular Euro-American writers and texts. The frank conversation between Dora and Sappho is not only playful, but racy, and many would view it even as dangerous. Sappho's calling Dora a, quote, little gourmand is nothing less than a subtext for the two friends' possible desire to remain single and explore the advances of multiple suitors rather than marry. This scene resonates with the newspaper clipping in Hopkins' scrapbook that tells the tale of two courting lovers who eventually tire of, quote, the joint mastication of gumdrops and other equally silly performances, end quote. Hopkins attempts to bring normalcy and acceptance to the sexual freedom of African-American women in Hagar's Daughter by questioning whether past that sexual dalliances limit the social mobility of whites to the degree that it does that of African-American women. Hopkins underscores his point by borrowing passages penned by successful European American women whose identities and status appears to improve through marriage, as well as their texts about the newfound socio-political freedoms of European American women. I'm sorry, there's a lot in there that needs to be proven with more detail, but I'm just trying to condense a lot into a short presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. In many respects, the ongoing politicization of African-American women's gender and sexuality as a form of political suppression remains in the shadows. Hopkins admonishes us to not only move, let's skip the slide, to not only move towards racial justice through, Hopkins admonishes us to move racial justice forward through inventing new ways of recording and provoking discourse about the stakes of social justice and political representation for Black women. Her work foreshadows the provocative tactics of some say-her-name activists who bare their breasts during marches. Hopkins, too, seeks to harness the power of pleasing spectacles, alluring, humorous, and shocking media to provoke thought, righteous indignation, and socio-political change. Her scrapbook dares us to look anew at the influence of performance as a philosophy and praxis had on the Colored American magazine and the histories of other sites of African American artistry and activism at the turn of the century. Thank you.
Oh, John.
Hello, everyone. These papers intersect in fascinating and useful ways. Professors Cook and Flint-Martin grapple with different aspects of One Blood. Professors Flint-Martin and Logan discuss Hopkins' work at the Colored American magazine, or CAM as I'll refer to it, with the former addressing the pressures on her during her tenure there, and the latter connecting her earlier life to her time at and publications in the magazine. Finally, Professors Logan and Cook touch on Hopkins' interest in and/or depictions of mesmerism. Professor Cook has presented us with a challenging paper that relates to, among other things, Pauline Hopkins' use of the African-American Gothic, the concepts of equivocation and civil death, and the numerous instances of physical, psychological, legal, and even linguistic imprisonment in Of One Blood. My questions are these. First, what are we to make of, and how should we respond to Rural Briggs's imposition of a new identity on Diantha Lusk later in Of One Blood? I mean, in connection with this earlier scene that Professor Cook reads in great detail. And second, what is Hopkins saying about justice through Diantha's equivocation in the novel? Professor Flint-Martin's discussion of the internal and external politics Pauline Hopkins had to contend with at CAM builds on Lois Brown and Hannah Wallinger's biographies and other Hopkins scholarship. It is indeed fascinating, as Professor Flint-Martin notes, that Rural Briggs's descent into unconsciousness coincides with the gap in CAM's publication of One Blood. The question is whether this is more than coincidence. And it relates to a key issue in connection with Hopkins' serials. Did she complete them before publication or write them month to month? In the case of Hagar's Daughter, she must have been working at least somewhat ahead, in order to commission the illustrations for the early chapters. In any case, the shift from a progressive to a circular temporality that Professor Flint-Martin discerns in the novel is highly significant. On the one hand, it relates to the challenges that late 19th and early 20th century African Americans faced in writing about a country obsessed with progress that denied them with civil rights, as brilliantly discussed by Greg Lasky in Untimely Democracy, The Politics of Progress After Slavery, whom Professor Flint-Martin cites. On the other hand, it relates to the role that Ethiopianism, with its circular view of history, plays in the novel. I'm so excited about Professor Logan's paper, which opens up so many new areas of inquiry for Hopkins scholars, fans, and general readers of her work. There's so much that I could say in response to it, but as I'm sure others have questions and comments about the paper, I will cut to my major questions connected with it. Is Hopkins' scrapbook the missing link between her career in drama in the late 1870s and early 1880s and her career as an editor, journalist, and fiction writer 20 years later? And as though who knows me are aware that Edgar Allan Poe is often on my mind, has this link been hidden in plain sight all these years, with Professor Logan being the first scholar to take the scrapbook and its importance and implications seriously? I've often said that Pauline Hopkins' life and texts are the gifts that keep on giving. Today, with these papers, we have another vivid instance of this. Thank you very much.
Can I invite I think we can probably take our, I want to say masks, I mean, our mics off. And I think we're a group that's not too big that we can probably have a conversation with our mics on, I think. And I'll just begin by thanking everybody again. And I asked John to be the respondent because this is a 20-year anniversary of the publication of The Unruly Voice. So it's so great to have John 20 years later being the respondent to this panel. We have some great questions John has left us with, lots of other questions. So yeah, I'd just like to invite other people to have a chance to ask questions or to talk. And I think we can try to experiment without our mics on or our masks off. So please.
So I had one. My name's Charles Boyd. I'm a professor of history at Georgia State, and I'm currently working on actually an essay about Hopkins for an anthology of unsung 20th century Black heroes. So my question is, I had found a quote from around the turn of the century where Hopkins had said that she thought that women's suffrage was a good thing. I think she said something to the effect of, if limited to some degree. What I was trying to figure out is if her views ever evolved on this and she ever became sort of a full-fledged supporter of women's suffrage, or if the view that she laid out there was probably the view she had for the rest of her life. I'd be curious if anybody could speak to that.
I believe, and it's been a while, but I believe that one of the problems that Hopkins had with women's suffrage is that it meant that there would be many more white women than Black women voting, and that as a result, it would diminish the political power of African Americans. But it's been a long time since I read about that and grappled with that. But let me throw that out there at least as a possibility.
Thank you.
I guess, and the only thing I'm thinking about, I mean, this also comes up with the way people often, place Du Bois and Booker T. Washington at odds. But I don't think Du Bois was open to saying necessarily, anyone and everyone should have, voting rights. I mean, he was somewhat classist of himself. I think they were just saying, whatever restrictions you're going to place on African Americans, they have to be placed on everyone. So if you're going to have restrictions for education or property, they have to be the same across the board. So I think it was more of that gesture, but I think sometimes when we read that from our 21st century perspective, we want to read that from a conservative lens. But I think it's more to sort of what John is speaking to is, what are the, trying to get down to what exactly does giving that vote mean within this context of there's so much inequity across the board politically amongst whites and African Americans.
Thank you.
You may have also already found in your research, at least through the Colored American magazine, that when she was working there, she was very much pushing out articles on Black women and highlighting them as characters and publishing their portraits and emphasizing the work that they were doing. And then when the switch happened and Fred Moore and by extension, Washington took over the publication, that emphasis on gender kind of disappeared altogether. So I think that could add another lens of whether or not she's necessarily pro-suffrage. She very much did work with the magazine to put out women's stories.
Thank you. That's a good point also.
Do you mind if I ask you a question, Charles? Where did you find that quote?
Oh, sure, no problem. So the quote was found, and I could pull up the page number, but I found it in Lois Brown's biography of Hopkins. Let me see if I can, because if I can pull up the paper draft, I can figure out. Okay, hold on 1 second.
That's okay. I can take a look at it.
Oh, it was on page 307 or 308.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
And Alicia, do you have a question?
I did. I always end up cutting people off when I try and ask, so I figured it'd be safe to raise my hand first. I'll lower it in a minute. All the papers were really fantastic, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to ask one question so that others have a chance to ask as well. And this is for Professor Cook. And I was really interested in the argument that you're developing about equivocal bodies. And I was wondering how you might extend that idea to consider the birthmarks that the main characters have, something that is very much visible on the body. And I was just curious what you might do with it if you haven't already considered that element of the book.
Wow, I hadn't considered that. It's so funny. I'm always tempted to bring in Spillers well, with everything I do, but I can see how using Spillers as a way to really unpack this gendering that we're all picking up in these papers might be a really great way to also consider this type of marking. What I like about this question is that it also presents a bit of a note of challenge where I think I would have to where I think that you can see how this marking on the body is at once a type of generational thing, right? It's that culturally repressed part, but it's also just very biologically present. So I don't know. I need to think on this, but my first impulse is Spillers as a way to get in there.
Yeah, I didn't mean to stump you. I figured you would need to chew on it for a while, just as I'm continuing to think about all the papers and let everything kind of sit in. But there was just something about the way in which, I remember reading the novel the first time, being very frustrated that no one noticed each other's birthmarks. No one noticed anyone's birthmark until the very end.
Right.
And then when I think about this idea of equivocation and just making things, ambiguous and concealing, what does it mean to have something like that concealed, but then revealed at the very end? What is Hopkins trying to say? So I didn't ask it because I knew an answer. I was just really curious about how you could use your work to bring in that really important symbol in the novel.
And I love it, but especially because, with rereading, the birthmark even takes on greater significance. So I'm really grateful for that. So thank you.
Well, and if I could just follow up on Alicia's point, I just a quick sort of comment question for Professor Cook. One of the things that I really wanted to hear in the notion is what exactly are the poles of equivocation? What are the sites of equivocation that you're trying to get at? Are you talking about a racial continuum here that certainly in Dianthe Lusk is incredibly, is she white? Is she black? Right? That kind of thing. Is she a sister? Is she a lover? Is she a wife? I think, those gendered poles there. Is she an object of white desire, or is she a black woman with autonomous sexualities and actions? So as you continue to think with this, I can see how equivocation just really resonates with so much in the representations of Lusk in there. But I think it would be really useful for me as a reader in understanding that, to have them sort of grounded in specific aspects of the text like that. Well, I'll ask my one more little one, and then I'll start this for April here. Just April, this is so exciting what you are starting to look at here. It's really, really wonderful. And my question for you is about the date, it's 1846. That is the book she chose to use. Is that it? And so I'm wondering. Yeah, and if I'm understanding this right, she took it and put stuff in it, like glued over it on stuff. So you don't know for sure if this particular scrapbook meant anything to her?
I couldn't elaborate on it. Do you mean, I don't know if it meant something to her personally, like someone gave it to her as a personal gift, but what I'm leaning towards right now is that she was interested in the book as a statement about, as far as what is symbolized about popular print culture. The one slide that I showed of the HMS Pinafore, she actually pasted it under, like she kept part of the poem's title. And the poem's title was, I had it over here, A Plea for Illusion. So some of the other pages, she covered the entire thing. But in that page, she actually posted the advertisement right underneath A Plea for Illusion. And so I do feel like she might have actually been interested in what the annuals symbolized about print culture and what was acceptable uses of print culture. So that's where I'm leaning towards right now, based on looking at everything, is that she chose it in particular, or maybe she was having a conversation with other intellectuals and artists and someone shared it with her. It's hard to say, but I do think there was some choice or agency in it, not just arbitrary.
Thank you. Thank you.
Shireen, please. I think your mic's off.
Thanks. Yeah, like Alicia, I don't like to kind of burst in right in the middle of the conversation. Thank you all so much. I should say, for those of you who don't know, I am the president of the Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins Society, and I just really enjoy these panels, and very much thanks to both Johns for organizing this, and to staying in touch with the panelists as we had to make this transition from going from in person to Zoom and now hybrid. So really, I was just thrilled with all these papers, and like John through her, I saw a lot of really nice braids and interconnections between them. In particular, I was wondering about this idea, like just thinking of the way in which scrapbooking connects up with the ideas of temporality as well as preservation, right? Because on one hand, you have the preservation that's happening with the bodies, but the preservation of the scrapbooks. I did want to make sure to share with you, April, that Carla Peterson has this whole concept of narrative scrapbooking that she talks about that might be really useful. I think it's in the Black Gotham collection, but she may be writing about it elsewhere. But I thought that would be something for you to think about, especially the way that you're talking about Hopkins. And then Kelsey, I wanted to ask you more about temporalities. I was really interested in these micro moments where the time could change just within like one sentence or paragraph. And I was curious if you saw something similar with regards to geography and space. One of the things that's always struck me about Hopkins and the way she likes to play fast and loose with history is how she would, in Winona, like she'd move a battle, in space or in time. So it could so it would work for the narrative. And so I'm wondering if, the manipulations, I just wanted to hear more just about what you think was behind some of those manipulations of time and maybe how they would also interact with spatial manipulation as well.
Yeah, I actually, I found that they pair pretty well with the temporalities. When I drafted a longer version of this, I had actually originally included geography. The very first page that I say where she jumps from the recitations to the dreary weather, it had been raining like this for a week, it was the end of the day. I think it's within the next few paragraphs that she also talks about moving throughout Boston, and the winds blew to the east and you had to cross the bridge to get west. And so it's kind of that same markup where, at least in Boston, she's almost got very specific directions that I haven't been to Boston most recent enough to check, or am familiar with Boston geography in the late 1800s to know, but it does seem very specific. Whereas when she moves to Ethiopia, it's very much more of they moved this way for a full day, or they had to stop at this person to get permission to go here. And so they do seem to parallel a little bit. And then obviously Telstar is her own kind of creation for the most part. So I think that is a little bit more free, just like her temporalities there. So you can get lost very much so in that city. And I think all in all, it works to, you almost just feel different when you're reading that section of the novel. At least I do, because you are able to get lost in her world, unlike in Boston, where it feels almost rigid and structured when you're reading it. Like you can read chapter by chapter and you could envision it being serialized as this chapter happened, and then I had to wait, and you can tell you had to wait because the serialization says 3 months had passed and now you get to read this part again. So I did see that pairing a little bit with the geographic representations as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Yuri, would like to, your hands up too.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for these papers. They're great. And of course, because Brian Sweeney and I are finishing up the Broadview of One Blood edition, my brain has been going with this. So I just have two brief comments that just came out of some of my thinking about of One Blood right now is Rachel, so April, I've been thinking also about scrapbooks in relation to Hopkins's work. And one thing I will note is that Hopkins does borrow a quote from HMS Pinafore in Of One Blood. So that might be kind of an interesting sort of connection there. I could look up the specific place if you want to just send me an email and I could just let you know. And then Kelsey, in terms of like time, one of the things your paper brought up for me is this one puzzling moment that Brian and I noticed as we were working on the text of One Blood in chapter 3, where they talk about it being Hallows Eve, but then it says, right, but then the previous 2 chapters were set in November. And, so clearly possibly just an error, but I think the Hallows Eve chapter, maybe, I can't remember for sure, maybe it falls in the October issue of CAM, I'm not remembering, but I'm wondering if you've thought about that puzzling sort of blip in chronology and temporality in the narrative.
I had actually always wondered about that, and I haven't found a good reason for it, unless it's maybe an issue of she had originally organized it one way, or she, if she had written those first, chapter or two, and then decided that maybe she had found her scrapbook on the article on mesmerism, was like, oh, I want to include this in here. And because that's really the part where we see Diane coming back as a ghost. And I think it pairs really well with the first chapter, but in a very direct way that I don't think we get up until that point. So part of me was like, well, maybe Hallows Eve was not October 31st in the turn of the century. I'm not quite sure, I would have to look, but it does seem a bit out of place, almost as if she needed that spooky setting for the purpose of ghost stories. And it happened to line up, and maybe it was an error, but it does seem very much like the setting needs to fit the plot at that point.
Right. I think that, yeah, I think you're right there, Kelsey. I also remember, and I've forgotten, because at one point Brian and I researched this and then I totally forgot. I buried it until your talk, that I think it had something to do with the exigencies of the publishing schedule too. And I think I'd have to go back and look at what issue of CAM that installment showed up in. But I mean, it's your comment makes me wonder if it's, I just assumed it was just an error, but your comment makes me wonder if it's actually more interesting. Your paper makes me wonder if it's actually a more interesting error than just one I thought of before. So than I thought previously. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. And I don't have it marked in. I used to have all of the publications marked out actually in my book, and I don't have one marked out for that. So it would be interesting to look at when that particular edition came out, because I have all three listed as coming out at a similar time, which doesn't quite seem right then with that temporality. You think she would have seen that coming?
Thank you.
April?
I don't know if this is really helpful, but I really enjoyed your paper too, Professor Cook. And I think really what it's sort of the other thread that kind of cuts across for me, I think a lot about with my work. I read a lot of women writers, and a lot of them, Ida B. Wells Cooper, and all of them are really interested in sort of challenging, narratives of progress at that time, because there were a lot of people using narratives to prove African American regress at that moment. And so a lot of them were really invested in critiquing these sort of narratives of progress and thinking about Professor Cook's. I guess I'm wondering, did she mean literally Halloween, or, is that like another sign, much like the birthmark and everything else? Was it really just a gesturing towards, this is a time of ghosts, where, we're struggling with, are we really in this moment? Or are we still just, haunted by all of these things of the slave past, because that was the idea. Now you're going into 1900, there's this progress. And so I don't know, maybe that's useful to think about too, what she meant when she said Hallows Eve is, again, you want to read it and say, oh, this is about Halloween, but maybe she's saying, well, that's part of the problem, is that, people are constantly infusing, much like these persons, these ideas into these signs. And that's, to me, that's how I'm seeing the connection. So maybe that's also something to think about, but along with other questions.
We have a few minutes left, I think, before we turn it to pumpkins. So anyone else have a question for any of our panelists or for a respondent?
Kelsey, one question I have, and this kind of followed piggybacking on the discussion the exchange between you and Yuri, is on the one hand, you're talking about how Hopkins' editorial role expanded and she had more freedom when Dupree took over. And yet on the other hand, you say that the amount of space for Of One Blood actually diminished. I'm not suggesting it was a one-to-one situation. It may have just been what fit where. But do you have any thoughts on you would think on the one hand, well, she's in charge here, she could give herself more space. but apparently that's not the way it worked out. And it may be just that she wanted to spread out what was left of One Blood in a few more issues. And so they were shorter installments than some of the previous ones. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd actually considered that because to me, it almost feels like that once the shift in ownership happens, the story almost feels rushed in a way that it hasn't leading up to that point. Kind of like she's anxious to get us through Ethiopia and kind of get the story over maybe before she didn't have the opportunity to publish anymore. She seems to be almost aware that her time at the magazine, even though she does have this editorial support, that there's all these changes going on and that the financial instability could always come back. So I had the sense that she was almost rushing through her story, but also that the fiction of it wasn't necessarily taking priority anymore, that maybe she had already had it written, it was just doing edits, or was more intent in publishing all of these other articles that went along with it that could more directly and less literarily challenge Washington. And I also found it interesting that when the shift happened, one of her notes, I can't remember if her name was on it or if it was just in her voice, said something about how they were still dedicated to publishing like good, clean, house-friendly stories. And I feel like the end of One Blood ends up not being so clean and family-friendly as she seems to be putting it out there. So I also kind of wonder if she knew that was the turn her story was taking. And in an effort to redeem it for the sake of the magazine, she kind of shortened it a little bit in order to focus on the exterior articles or the paratext to her story.
Any final questions? I think we're just about out of time to make the official 90-minute window for the ALA, but any final questions? I'd like to thank our panelists and thank John, and I think we had a great panel. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody. And final reminder that we have the Pauline Hopkins business meeting July 9th at 5 p.m. It's in the ALA catalog. And I think, Shireen, did we send one out the Zoom link? Then I saw you chatted it, so it's there.
I did, yeah. I just put the Zoom link in the chat, and I think I will probably ask Mary Frances maybe to also send something out to the listserv to make sure we capture some more people. So there'll be some reminders, but thank you. Yes, the meeting will be July 9th, 5 p.m. Eastern.
All right, wonderful. I'm going to stop officially recording. If you want to hang out for a few more minutes to say goodbye, I will stop this. And okay, I'm going to, let's see. Do you want to stop recording? Yes.